Hebrews will make swords and spears. So that was the thing that the Philistines had done. They kept Israel from having blacksmiths, or in that time they called them smiths. They kept them from having those things. So those people whose name is Smith, probably in the old time days, your family originally came from a blacksmith type family, and they were simply called smiths. So as we look at that, as there were very few people in this time that had the access to blacksmiths, to the iron works, to iron ore, that were able to make swords and spears. Verse 20 goes on to say, so all Israel went down to the Philistines, each to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, and his hoe. The charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshare, for the mattocks, the forks, the axes, and to fix the hoes. Now, verse 20 and 21 tell us that the Philistines held the key to Israel, because they had to go to them to get their instruments sharpened. Now, for us, yesterday I had the chainsaw out and I was cutting some limbs off, and told my wife, I said, I desperately need a new chain. I need a new chain for this thing, because it's like burning through the wood instead of cutting. Well, to get that chain sharpened, I've got to take it to somebody who can either sharpen it, or I've got to go buy a new chain that's sharp to get the job done. So as we think about that, it's like, if you've ever tried to dig in the ground that's hard with a dull shovel, it's not fun. If you've ever tried to use post hole diggers, if you've ever been in the youth group with me, chances are you've had your hands on post hole diggers digging a hole at some point. But those things need to be sharp, because if they're not sharp, they're virtually useless. They're very hard to use. If you've ever tried to chop a tree down with a dull axe, that's not working either. But these things had to be sharpened by them. But look at this. In verse 21, it says, the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares, for the mattocks, the forks, the axes, and to fix the hoe. So to do those things, it cost 2/3 of a shekel. Now, if according to Israelites' way of counting money, it would be a pim, which would be 2/3 of a shekel, which was a high price, because a shekel was like a month's salary. Can you imagine? You're paying 2/3 of what you got for the month just to get your axe and hose sharpened. Yeah, that's to me, that's crazy. It's like, we today, 2/3 of our salary for a month probably goes for a house payment and a car payment. I mean, that's huge. That's for us today. But to get a chain sharpened, or for our chainsaw, $4 or $5. To get a new chain, $10. It's a drop in the bucket for what our salary would be compared to what they were paying here. Let me grab a Bible. I'll be right back. Let me look this up real quick, because I want to make sure I quote this right. I always try to compare the different versions, the different interpretations of the Bible, so that we get a good glimpse. In verse 21, it says, yet, this is King James, it says, yet they had a file for the mattocks, and for the coulters, and for the forks, and for the axes, and to sharpen the goads. So in verse 21, if you read in King James, it says they had a file. In other words, they had a way to sharpen that. In the King James Version, it doesn't mention money. In the other versions that I looked in, all of them talked about the charge being for the shekel. Now, we can probably spend a good bit of time asking ourselves, okay, so how can you understand that they had the file over here to how much money it was over here? I can't answer that question. I don't know why King James says one thing and every other version says something that's a little different from there. I don't know. Maybe in those times that when they were interpreting from the Greek and the Hebrew into the King's English, it didn't translate at that time. Obviously, we know more now than we knew then on translations on what words mean as well. I'm not discounting what the King James Bible says. What I want to do is I want to take both of those and I want to get an understanding of that. They still had to go over to the Philistines because the Philistines, according to the King James word, had a file. Now, if I really wanted to do it, I would get a file and I would sharpen my chainsaw chain because I have a file. You know what a file is made out of? It's made out of metal, and it is hard, and it is made to sharpen. And they didn't have one. They had to go to the Philistines to get them to do that. So whether or not they had one of those fancy grinding wheels that they spun around and they ground the axe on, or they had a file to sharpen it with, I don't know what they used, but I do know this, that if there was a file available, the Philistines had it because they had the market on iron and on blacksmiths. So that's verse 21. Verse 22 goes on to say, so it came about on the day of the battle that neither sword nor spear was found in the hands of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, but they were found with Saul and his son Jonathan. And the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. So as we see, the only people who are prepared for battle is Saul and his son Jonathan. They're the only ones that have a sword and a spear. They're the only ones that were found with those equipment was Saul and Jonathan. You know, we've often preached and we've often taught and we talk about a lot that God is going to equip us for whatever battle he places in front of us. Well, next week we're going to see what happens. We're going to dig in a little bit deeper and get on into chapter 14. But I just want you to understand today that whether God has given them, the Israelites, a sword, a spear, or a plowshare, or a hoe to go to battle with, he's equipped them to go to battle. And if it's within his will, no matter what we take into battle, God will use to defeat the enemy. You know, we think about sometimes that in our Christian walk we'll say, I'm just not sure that I'm equipped enough. I'm not strong enough to take on the enemy. I'm not strong enough. I'm too weak as a Christian in my walk to take on the enemy. You're absolutely right. I cannot take on the enemy. I cannot go to battle on my own. It is God within me. Even in my weakest state and my weakest point, God has to be with me as I go into battle. It is God who gets the victory, not us. We just simply have to follow God as he is intended and to follow his word and to be faithful to him if we intend on going forward and getting a victory for him as we go into battle. You know, this morning, I always like to say, and I didn't write it down this morning, so here it comes, off the cuff. I didn't write anything down. There's no bottom line note up here for me to look at. I will say this, the bottom line here is this. Go back to verses 8 and 9. When Saul disobeyed what God had laid out, it cost him his kingship. It cost him his walk with God. And Samuel spells that out. When we fail to do what God has laid before us, oftentimes we miss what God has for us. If God has a vision, I'm going to use a pastor. I've even used myself. If God has a vision for me and God has told me what I need to do, and I fail to do it, it's very likely that God is going to move me and put somebody else in my place that is going to follow and do what God has told that pastor to do. So as we look at that, God has a purpose for our life. God has a direction for our life, and God has a will for our life. I don't know what God's will is for your life. If I did, I would tell you. I wish somebody would told me 25 years ago, this is where you're going to be in 25 years. I'll tell you, I probably would have laughed. 30 years ago, somebody said, you're going to be a pastor at a church. I'm like, no, you crazy. Not this guy. Not me. I'm not going to be pastor in a church. I mean, I don't even want to teach a Sunday school class. I don't even know what you're talking about. But God's got a purpose, God's got a plan, and God's got a way to get you there. And what you have to be willing to do, the bottom line today is we have to be willing to listen to what God is saying, whether it's through his messages, it's through his music, through no matter what it's through. I will say this, God's got this. Some of you are in the healthcare profession. As you get up and you go to work every day, and you go in the midst of the hospital, or you go into the doctor's office, and you're faced with, hey, somebody may walk through that door. I may have a patient today that tests positive for COVID-19. There may be things that are going on that take place. God's got it. If God intends for you to be a witness, then you should be a witness. If God intends for you to be sick, then we ought to be sick, but we ought to be sick as a witness for him and point to him. As I had an opportunity to talk to a friend of mine this week that had been in the hospital for 12 days. She's back home. She's doing good. She's a witness to God for what God has done in her life. It's great. The doctors, she'll tell you, the doctors, the nurses, everybody there was awesome to her. But the reason she's back home is one reason and one reason only. That's because that's what God intended. She's back home because that's where God intended for her to be. Bottom line is we need to be faithful, and we need to point others to Jesus Christ, and we need to do what God has asked us to do in these times. I'm gonna pray for us, and